Hello, this is my alternative assignment for week 5 or unit 9 and 10. Um, and I really want to discuss two concepts that I found really interesting, conditioned reinforcement and stimulus control. While these are presented as separate topics, I found that the readings and videos really kind of demonstrated how closely related they are. The common theme I took away is that behavior is often kind of influenced not only by reinforcement itself, but also by the information that environmental stimuli provide about reinforcement. Um, this emphasis is reflected throughout the course materials as well, and I felt that it really describes well like conditioned reinforcement, stimulus control, discrimination, and generalization as like complementary processes. Um, I really think that like traditionally conditioned reinforcers are viewed as neutral stimuli that acquire reinforcing properties after being paired with the primary reinforcements. So, for example, a token becomes valuable because it has been repeatedly associated with backup reinforcers, such as food or preferred activities or items. Um, and then I really found it interesting how we distinguish between a simple conditioned reinforcer, which typically are paired with a single backup reinforcer, and generalized condition reinforcers such as money and tokens, which are paired with many different reinforcers and are less susceptible to satiation. Really, this was kind of like a review of what we've learned in like grad school and our masters. But I think it was really interesting to see kind of like the more nuanced understanding that Williams kind of reviews evidence suggesting that condition reinforcement may not be fully explained by those simple stimulus pairing. Instead, some of the effects attributed to conditioned reinforcement may occur because the stimuli provide information about when reinforcement is available or because they signal that reinforcement is becoming more likely. This perspective was really reinforced by the SQAB tutorial with Tim Shanahan's, I don't know how to say that, but rather than asking whether a stimulus simply becomes reinforcing through pairing, I like how they discuss choice models that examine how organisms allocate behavior based on the relative value of available alternatives. And one model I found especially interesting was delay reduction theory. This theory really proposes that the value of a conditioned stimulus depends on how much it reduces the expected delay to reinforcement. So in other words, the stimulus becomes valuable because it signals that reinforcement is getting closer. And the slides summarize this idea through what they call the information or signaling theory, which really suggests that conditioned stimuli acquire value because they provide information about an upcoming change in reinforcement conditions. I also found this really interesting from the like other perspective that like punishment can do this too, right? Like, or like it could maybe occasion like problem behavior as well. I have a really interesting case right now that I think is such a good example of this. And the team has really been pushing a schedule, like a visual schedule, not the behavior team, but like the other team. And when we came on the case, it was almost like the schedule became a conditioned punishment for activities because of this long history with it, how they were using it. So now we're coming in and kind of looking at how to reverse that and make it more reinforcing. So this was actually really interesting. They actually, like in the case that I'm talking about, they actually ended up, after they stopped using the schedule and a token board, they had accidentally made like going on outings like a punishment contingency, and like talking about outings will cause like instant problem behavior and nobody could figure it out because he loves going on outings. But I digress. So it's already starting. My main point being is that this is already really starting to help me like rethink some of the cases I have right now and how I can use like visuals to create more denser schedules of reinforcement to replace that learning history. So it was really one of my biggest takeaways. Rather than viewing conditioned reinforcement as a process in which stimuli simply gain reinforcing power through pairing, I think it is more accurate to consider kind of like the predictive information those stimuli provide. This interpretation also seems to fit many applied situations. So when we use praise, tokens, or visual schedules, those stimuli may be effective not only because they have been paired with reinforcement, but also because they reliably signal that reinforcement is available or that the learner is progressing towards reinforcement. So, yeah, and like I think task analysis too, when you think about it, that's the whole premise behind them is the SD response. Reinforcement being like the next step, and I think schedules are really similar, but it's just really interesting because this is timely again with this like whole schedule case that I have. And then this kind of really naturally leads into Unit 10 on stimulus control. Stimulus control occurs when behavior is more likely to occur in the presence of one stimulus than another because of a history of differential reinforcement. And the course materials really describe this as a response occurring more frequently in the presence of a discriminative stimulus than in its absence. They also kind of explain that sharp discrimination gradients indicate strong stimulus control, whereas flatter gradients reflect greater generalization. I found like the gradients so interesting, and I love the research on this and the graphs. It took me a while to kind of wrap my head around a lot of the older research, just because it was written in a way that I guess like I've never read before, kind of. And I really enjoyed it though, because I think like as an applied practitioner, it was really cool to see this sort of like experimental roots of behavior analysis in that kind of like research capacity. And it makes me think as I'm kind of like as I'm like in this whole PhD process, and I'm still really like so rooted in everything I do in the applied setting to really kind of look at it and think about like how might I do my dissertation to do something more like this instead of focusing so hard on the applied part that we're always looking at. I think like developing my thesis, I really like focused on applied work. And while I was using like experimental analysis, I guess I never thought about like other ways that I could do staff training research to be more EAB, different things like that, especially when solving problems around like generalization, which when you work in group homes, generalizing skills for staff and maintaining staff behavior, especially in like the training of direct support professionals, can be kind of like the hardest, and that's where the biggest gaps are in the literature. So it's kind of got me thinking about like where I actually want my dissertation to go and how to collect data so that it's a little bit more like a better visualization, especially for things like staff fidelity where we tend to use percentage, like maybe looking more at rates per hour and being a little bit more precise. And I think that that's the biggest thing I've taken away from this class overall, but especially these units, just when I'm really thinking through like taking off that applied practice brain and really like looking at how we can use it in more experimental ways as I become more of like a PhD researcher versus an applied practitioner, or how I can be both, I guess, because I think a lot of this could be applied to both if you try. And a stimulus can both signal and reinforcement availability. So really, so rather than viewing these as separate explanations, I think they complement one another. And a stimulus can both signal reinforcement availability and influence future responding, and making it difficult to separate conditioned reinforcement from stimulus control in like a lot of situations. And I really think that this has important implications for applied practice too. So we often rely on conditioned reinforcers such as praise, tokens, visual schedules, or feedback. But these units really reminded me that we should also pay attention to the discriminative information these stimuli provide. Especially if our goal is like durable behavior change, we need to ensure that natural environment cues eventually gain instructional control, rather than allowing artificial prompts or contrived reinforcements to become the only variables controlling behavior. Um, and I think these units really shifted my thinking from asking whether stimulus is a conditioned reinforcer to asking why is it effective. Is it because it has been paired with reinforcement or punishment, or is it because it signals that reinforcement is available, or is it because it has come to exert stimulus control? And I really think that the answer is often some combinations of all three, and understanding those interactions can help us design more effective interventions and really better understand the processes underlying behavior. And I'm excited to kind of put this to use and to talk to my supervisees about it, because I've been bringing a lot of this class back to my supervision just to have some of those more like task list conversations and go a little bit more in depth into like what the clinical work that we're doing in group homes. Um, so, yay. Thanks for listening. Hope y'all had a good weekend. Bye.